The year is 1959, and work on the Matterhorn Bobsleds was nearing completion. It was time to start building the exterior rockwork of the mountain. Imagineer Fred Yerger, who was the head of the model-making department at WED, was tasked with designing the incredible rockwork facade of the mountain. This was no easy job, as making realistic-looking rock was a challenge for anyone, because it involved amazing attention to detail and great skills at sculpting, in order to make the structures look natural. Fred was used to creating models. In fact, many of his models became full-size structures at Disneyland. But this was a mountain. He had helped with the design of Schweitzer Falls in the Jungle Cruise, and so began work building a model of the rockwork for the Matterhorn. The result was nothing short of spectacular. To create the outer shell of the mountain, the part which looks like rock, Imagineers employed a technique which was previously used to build Schweitzer Falls in Adventureland just 4 years earlier. Steel rebar was bent and welded into sections of mountain. From there, a fine steel mesh was attached to the rebar. The sections were then lifted up to the mountain and installed, working from top down to bottom. A special mix of concrete was sprayed onto the steel mesh, which made the two materials act as one rigid structure. From there, the mountain was painted with a dark gray for the rocks, and certain areas were carefully painted white for the snow. The finished product looked amazing for its time, and even to this very day, Fred Yerger's Matterhorn rockwork can still compete with its more modern mountainous counterparts. The project was going far over budget, and the plans to install a few caverns were scrapped. The interior of the mountain would be left hollow, but to ensure the steel wasn't fully exposed, the beams were wrapped with canvas, which was painted in shades of icy blue and white, although the result was not at all convincing. Walt had Imagineers leave plenty of open areas in the rockwork for guests to peer out and see the park, leaving the mountain with as many holes as a block of Swiss cheese. The Matterhorn Bobsleds was part of a major expansion of Tomorrowland, which included adding the monorail and submarine voyage through liquid space. The Tomorrowland expansion was touted as Disneyland's grand reopening, and the 3 attractions were unveiled to the public on June 14, 1959. Now, if you heard me say the Matterhorn was part of Tomorrowland, you heard correctly. It wasn't considered a Fantasyland ride until its major remodel in 1978. Ride operators, mountain climbers, and even Tinker Bell herself all had a place inside the Matterhorn structure to relax and prepare for work. Walt hated wasting space, and since the ride itself only reaches halfway up the mountain, there was a large space on the upper level that would have otherwise been underutilized. They turned it into a type of break room. In the 1960s, one cast member even brought in a basketball hoop and installed it on one of the beams, making a kind of miniature half-court so they could play on their breaks. This led to the rumor that it's up there because local building ordinances dictated that a structure over a certain height could not be built unless it was for a sports venue, which is a ridiculous notion. There's no basketball court up there. It's a hoop and a half oval crudely drawn on the floor. Now, I know I mentioned earlier that the Matterhorn is the world's largest scale model, so I'll take a moment to explain that. Walt wanted the Matterhorn replicated as closely as possible at Disneyland. So, Imagineers made a model of the Swiss mountain, taking into consideration its most prominent features, and then scaled the mountain down to 1/100th of its real size. And so, while the mountain in the Swiss Alps measures 14,700 feet high, the one at Disneyland is only 147. That means if a 6-foot-tall person were to be scaled down to match the Disney mountain, they would stand 18.28 millimeters tall, or just under 3/4 of an inch. To put that into perspective, if you stood a US dime on its side, that's roughly how tall you'd be standing next to it. When the Matterhorn was approaching the end of its second decade, the park decided to invest in a significant upgrade to the ride. In 1978, the attraction underwent a refurbishment, enlarging the queue where riders lined up, as well as finally installing those caverns that Walt wanted, which resulted in many of the mountain's holes being patched up and enclosed. Once again, Fred Yerger was brought in to design the beautiful icy interiors of the Matterhorn, an artist complementing his earlier work with 2 decades of accrued knowledge since he last touched it. These new icy interiors were made of 3 layers of plaster spread over steel mesh, which was attached to a web of shaped rebar, then mounted on steel framework supports. Fred Yerger explained, "The renovation of our Matterhorn is just the completion of Walt's original idea. many of the Matterhorn's original plans were postponed. Because of the popularity of the Matterhorn, it would have been difficult to close the attraction for reconstruction before now. But with Space Mountain entertaining guests who need a thrill experience, we can finally finish most of Walt's original plan. Fred Yerger retired the next year, in 1979, leaving behind an expansive legacy of models and designs for the company's theme parks, projects too numerous to count. Possibly the most iconic addition to the mountain in 1978 was the Abominable Snowman. The cast members eventually nicknamed him Harold, and he spent his days frightening the bobsledders as they glided through his cave. Then just before the ride ends, you see him one last time. There were 3 snowmen built for the ride. The first is visible on both tracks towards the start, but the last 2 are each seen from their own respective track. What's interesting was that only one of these 3 snowmen was built from scratch. The other 2 were actually recycled animatronics from another Disneyland attraction. A year earlier, in 1977, Mark Davis was tasked with refurbishing the Jungle Cruise. Back then, there was a scene that depicted 2 gorillas that stood upright and then raised their arms in protest at the passing boats. These animals appeared unsettling to passengers, so Mark removed them, and when the Matterhorn team caught wind of this, they saw an opportunity to repurpose them. They were given new white fur, new body-shaped shells, and matching monster faces, of which were sculpted by Imagineer Blaine Gibson. And speaking of bobsleds, to increase the ride's capacity, this was the year the Matterhorn received the tandem bobsleds. These bobsleds were white with a striped design on the sides. They were built so that 2 bobsleds were joined together. And since the seats themselves were still tandem seats, that meant these tandem bobsleds had a capacity of 8 riders, as opposed to a single bobsled of just 4. During this refurbishment, Jack Wagner, who was known as the voice of Disneyland, recorded his most iconic safety spiel.
Remain seated, please. Permanecer sentados, por favor.
The Matterhorn remained relatively untouched in the decades after, and riders in the Skyway enjoyed traveling right through the center of the mountain. Then, in 1994, 2 changes took place. The first was the addition of a new scene. Imagineers added a place in the mountain where glowing crystals were seemingly discovered by an expedition of trekkers. A supply box marked Wells gave a nod to the last name of the Disney company president, Frank Wells, who tragically died earlier that year. You see, Frank Wells had a dream of climbing the 7 summits of the world. He made it to 6 of them, but that year he went on a ski trip to Nevada and his helicopter crashed. The second change of 1994 came at the end of the year, when the Skyway was forever dismantled after damages from the Northridge earthquake required expensive repairs. After Disneyland celebrated its 55th anniversary in 2010, resort management had taken a hard look at the aging mountain. After 5 decades without a major repaint, the mountain was starting to look a little yellow. The Matterhorn had received paint touch-ups every decade or so, but mainly to the snow on top. But meanwhile, the gray rockwork was left to bleach in the sunlight. Also, the tandem seats were no longer considered safe. You see, guests had to share a seatbelt, a practice which didn't actually secure people in the bobsleds anyway, and guests often preferred being seated separately, which negated the capacity increase of 1978. Immediately, the company assigned Imagineers to the task of fixing up the Matterhorn, and in 2012, for the first time since its construction, the mountain was covered from top to bottom in scaffolds. The old paint scheme was being stripped off and replaced with a richer gray rock color to match the original Swiss mountain. With the new paint applied, they added highlighted touches to the rock to give the color scheme some depth. The snow was entirely reapplied with a realistic touch. Instead of patches of white paint, this time the technique allowed for a wind-whipped snowy look. The special paint that was applied had small beads of glass in it, the idea being that when the sun reflected off the beads, the snow would glisten realistically, and indeed it worked. As for the inside of the Matterhorn, the caves were repainted, and some of the track rails had extra support brackets welded in place to make it more rigid. Harold the Abominable Snowman was given new white fur, and the crystals in the Wells expedition had their lights fixed so they glowed colorfully once again, using newly installed LED technology. The mountain also got retrofitted with more catwalks and handrails to meet the stricter Cal-OSHA standards that went in place in the early 2010s. These standards were meant to make rides like this one safer for both cast members and riders. It's true that parts of the ride lost their original aesthetics, but it's a small price to pay for safety. Another safety feature that changed was Jack Wagner's Remain Seated spiel at the loading area. They replaced the original spiel with a slightly longer one that he originally recorded specifically for breakdowns.
Please remain seated with your seatbelt fastened. Permanecer sentados, por favor.
The last addition to the 2012 refurbishment was a new series of bobsleds. These bobsleds were still tandem, so they went through the ride two at a time. However, the seats themselves were designed for individuals. This meant there was room for 3 seats per bobsled, making each train a full capacity of 6 people. The new bobsleds looked great, but an old issue arose upon their introduction. You see, people had forgotten just how uncomfortable the ride was due to its track design. They assumed that the old bobsleds were the issue. So when people got aboard the new bobsleds, they were surprised to see that the ride wasn't any smoother. There was an outcry by fans for Disney to fix the ride. The fix didn't come until the year 2015 when the park underwent Project Sparkle to get everything ready for Disneyland's 60th anniversary. The bobsleds received padding to make the ride a little more bearable, and to appease the fans, a new abominable snowman was installed. This one is arguably scarier and more animated. The 2 Jungle Cruise Gorilla Snowmen were presumably thrown away, but the original custom-built monster that could be seen from both tracks was saved by the Disney Archives team and can now be found on display in the queue of the Guardians of the Galaxy ride in Disney California Adventure. They even added new screens to the chain lift area, where you can see the snowman stalking you as you climb higher and higher into the mountain. The new abominable snowman wasn't the only addition. The Wells Expedition scene from 1994 was replaced with a new one, where an assortment of old ride vehicles and props had been collected by the snowman and stored here. This scene was also a bit of a controversy, as the fans had felt it wasn't right to remove the tribute to Frank Wells. By the end of the next year, the wooden crate labeled Wells was added back in amongst the collection. By 2018, it was time to refresh the bobsled since they were looking a little worn out. Meanwhile, the queue of the ride was expanded in the front. They added a new entrance structure, and while its use is necessary to mark the ride entrance, it also obstructs the view from the walkway of the original Swiss-themed building. In August of 2019, a chunk of the ride's rockwork the size of a door had fallen from it. This happened overnight after park hours, and the damage was discovered during a routine pre-opening safety walkthrough. Water splash from the adjacent falls had corroded the steel mesh holding the concrete to the structure. Over 6 decades of weather, seismic events, and wear and tear have taken their toll. It makes one wonder just how much longer can it last? I know a few roller coaster enthusiasts who feel that Matterhorn isn't worth their time. The ride has an average speed of 18 miles per hour, and there are no major drops, corkscrews, or loops, or any of that other kind of stuff you see in modern roller coasters nowadays. And there's a reason behind that. First, you're on a toboggan. Your vehicle shouldn't do anything a toboggan wouldn't do. Disneyland is not an amusement park. You're not here to ride the biggest and scariest rides ever built. You're here to be transported into another world. A world of stories, of adventure, of good clean fun. And the Matterhorn Bobsleds emulates that model very well. I find it both fascinating and amusing to think that this attraction was dreamed up on a whim by Walt Disney, with such an unassuming declaration on the back of a postcard, and that the ride engineering was designed by a man whose education was in automobile body design, and manufactured by a ride company that had never built a roller coaster before, but went on to become one of the world's leading roller coaster manufacturers. And all of this was done to hide an ugly central tower to a ride that has been gone for over 2.5 decades. But I digress. The Matterhorn Bobsleds has become a Disneyland classic. It's been the beacon that greets us at the beginning of our Disneyland adventure, and the final wave goodbye as we leave our beloved park. Despite all of the new attractions added to the park over the decades, the Matterhorn still towers over them as the tallest structure in Disneyland. Because no Imagineer has had the heart to build anything that rivals the size of Walt's beloved Swiss mountain. The Matterhorn has become a monument of memories, of excitement, of thrills, Everyone remembers their first ride aboard this mountain. It's been with us locals most of our lives, and even when the day comes for it to be rebuilt or replaced, it will still live on in our memory, forever standing. Another icon of Disneyland.
Please remain seated with your seatbelt fastened. Permanecer sentados, por favor.